I have to admit that I have a love-hate relationship with today's gospel passage. What do I love? I love that it models and calls us to deal with conflict directly. If another church member sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. Don't call 4 other church members and complain about that person. Don't retreat into your home and stop attending Bible study hoping someone will notice. Definitely don't bare your teeth in the shape of a smile, bake the person a pie, and deliver it while pretending nothing is wrong. Go and talk directly, alone first, and if that doesn't work, together with a third party. I also love that Jesus is pragmatic about the damage that unrepentantly toxic behavior can do to a community. He provides the option, unwelcome though it is, of setting and maintaining behavioral boundaries. I think there's a certain kind of American liberal, and I belong to this category, who chafes at this idea of excluding anyone for any reason ever. But consider the story of a colleague of mine who discovered that a male parishioner was making unwanted advances toward a female in the congregation. After a couple of gentle and unsuccessful conversations, this colleague and her wardens confronted the guy. No coming on to anyone at St. Swithin's by the Creek, not its real name, from here on out, period. He agreed. About a year later, my colleague learns of a handful of other female church members who've been the uncomfortable target of this man's behavior both before and after her warning. 2 of these women have quietly left the congregation. My colleague realizes that she has a predatory person on her hands, that he's been undermining the health and holiness of her church, and that she has failed to protect vulnerable members of her flock from abuse. She must ask him to leave. So yes, in Jesus' community, in Jesus' beloved community, all are welcome. And the health of the community takes precedence over the health of any one person. When a person's brokenness is so broken and so untransformed that it threatens others' safety, then Jesus advises in today's gospel, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector, i.e., an outsider. And yet, this teaching is also what I hate about today's passage, because it has paved the way for so much vicious exclusion in churches, so much scapegoating and shunning, more often of the betrayed than the betrayer. Consider a piano student that my mom used to teach many years ago. This was a young teenage girl whose family had belonged to a fundamentalist church in our town. Now, my mother was a mildly agnostic, occasional churchgoer of the mainline persuasion. So in this way, she was about as different from this family as you could be. Am I still audio? Can I still be heard? Okay. However, my mom's career was in many ways a ministry to the outcast wrapped in music lessons. And her compassion flared when this girl's family got kicked out of their new salvation, free Pentecostal, Calvary, Bible, whatever church. Actually, not just kicked out, shunned. Think about that. For years, they had built their entire social life at this place, And the charismatic pastor literally instructed the rest of the church membership not to speak to this family on pain of suffering the same fate. This family would run into old and deep friends like in the supermarket, and they would just walk past them as if they were a display of soup cans. Shunned, completely cut off, socially erased. Why? Because the pastor had called this young girl into his office for an appointment and said inappropriate things to her. Untrue things about the clothes she wore, accusations about behavior that the girl, who could not have been more than 14, didn't even understand. He used words like temptress and abomination. His eyes held the girl in a way that made her scalp hot and her ears buzz and her knees doughy, so that she wasn't sure they would hold when she finally got up and he dismissed her with the words, "So now you think about that." When she told her parents about the office visit, they scheduled their own to confront the pastor privately. 2 days later, the church secretary left a message on their answering machine. If they came to church on Sunday or any other day ever, they would be barred from entering the building. So these are two ways of playing out Jesus' instructions. One, the removal of a person for his refusal to change a behavior that is harming others. And the other, the removal of a family for their refusal to be silent, victims of such behavior. How do we, as a people of faith, honor the wisdom here without twisting the spirit? How do we make sure that we can be the first kind of community when we have to, and avoid being the second kind of community if we can possibly help it? As usual, friends, I don't have easy answers to difficult challenges, but it does strike me that my mom's piano student and her family were exiled without love, because they threatened the pastor's false narrative, his cover for his own abusive behavior. They had to be utterly discredited and silenced, utterly blotted out. My colleague, on the other hand, had to dismiss the predator in her church for the sake of others' safety. She didn't do it viciously or angrily. She did it firmly. She didn't treat the man as invisible or less than human. She didn't insist that anyone else do so either. And indeed, whereas my mother's student's pastor banished her family to protect the powerful, my colleague banished the predator in her church to protect the vulnerable. So maybe that's an important consideration. Is your community's action upholding the necessary boundaries with firmness but not cruelty? Is it undertaken in love? And maybe most importantly, is it protecting the weak or the strong? And let me say here, by the way, that I think this community is very healthy. So I'm not speaking about us in this moment. As for my mother, her heart went out to the family and especially to that girl. Her own uncle had come on to her when she had been about that age. And she had also once, as a young woman, been literally chased around a desk by a married minister she was working for. And of course, these stories are not unusual, although they should be, which is why #MeToo is a thing. Earlier, I referred to her teaching career as a ministry to the outcast wrapped in music lessons. And it strikes me now how much that 30-plus year career has been a model for my own pastoral one, and how it might stand as a model for the church as described in today's gospel. She was a champion for the unjustly excluded. She loved drawing out her students' musicality and watching them blossom. But even more, I think she loved using her role in their lives as a way to raise up the valleys of their self-esteem, to make the rough places plain. In more than a handful of childhoods, she was one of those other important adults who provided the much-needed affirmation and love that was missing elsewhere. The kid who was always criticized by a father, or who got teased at school, or who barely spoke a word to anyone. The gangly, the loud, the quirky, the misfit, the bullied, and indeed, the shunned. These were her specialty. She'd been one of them herself, and still carried the pain of that and the unfilled well of affirmation. In this way, she turned her own childhood wounds into a salve that she could offer others. She upheld boundaries and standards firmly. She undertook her work in love. She acted to protect and build up and bless the vulnerable. And so can we. Amen.